called Drugs, Assessment and Price, a Single European Regulator? Question mark. So I'm going to call up Frédéric Collet, Philippe Lamoureux, Nathalie Moll, Guido Razi, Nicolas Revel, and Jean-David Zaitoun will be chairing this roundtable. Let's begin. Thank you, Guy. Thank you, everyone, for being here. For this roundtable discussion, we will continue the conversation we started this morning during the discussion that took place with Madame Le Gudiec, her German colleague, that was managed by Jacques Gelbiti. And if you agree, we'll address some questions that weren't raised this morning, and we'll talk about the price of drugs, because that's the theme of this roundtable discussion. So we'll come back to assessment, which was already talked about this morning, with different opinions that were expressed, and it's not not criticism, but the opinions seemed quite conservative. And so I'm going to now turn to Nathalie Moll. I'd like to ask you about the opinion that we heard this morning. Should we go faster, farther on the centralization of the evaluation of drugs? Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for having invited me here. I think that we're dealing with certain urgencies and also with a revolution. The first emergency or urgency is the need to meet patient needs for quick access to health in all of Europe, the most equal and the quickest as possible. This morning, I liked the idea that Europe is the Café Flore of the world. And so we're very good at putting money into research, but not earning money from research. I think for the last 10 years now, we have set up pilot projects with UNHCA, we've run 3 joint assessments at the European level. There's proof that this can be done, and we need to meet patients' needs. We need to do it for approved products, but patients are also waiting for products that are under development. There are currently 7,000 in the pipeline right now, and we need to do this in a responsible manner and in the best way to avoid waste. The OECD has estimated that 20% of health spending in Europe is wasted. It's not possible to continue that way, and I think that multiple assessments in different countries makes no sense from a scientific standpoint. It's important to make the distinction between the economic and scientific aspects. If the regulations on the table now being debated in front of the Parliament are not clear enough on this point, industry agrees to support joint scientific evaluation, one that remains in the countries for the economic side. We're losing competitiveness. We're being weakened by Brexit. We're being weakened on an international level. When this morning we were talking about investments, yes, the European zone, we must show that we're making progress in a lot of fields, and one of these fields is in succeeding to work together as Europe to become an interesting platform for investment. And lastly, we're dealing with the technological revolution. We're talking about products of the past, but what about the products of the future? Biotech. They're very complex and difficult, especially products to deal with rare diseases. So it's hard to imagine that there are the resources in each country to do all of these assessments. So we need to pool our resources together. We need to agree on a scientific assessment and then leave economic considerations up to each country. So if we understand correctly, you, as the representative of the EFPIA, you would like to see more centralization on the scientific decisions. So we'll talk about, I'm not sure if you're going to get me to respond a lot. I completely agree with what was said. Our job as industrialists is quite simple. We need to innovate on one side and to ensure that new treatments, new molecules, new drugs reach the patient in the best possible conditions. And in order to do this, we need simple things in our environment. We need visibility, predictability, and we need equity, fairness also. All of the labs today are global players, and so we can compare what's being done in the different countries. In this very fertile environment that we talked about this morning in terms of innovation, there are some elements that strike us. We feel that access to certain drugs is becoming increasingly complex. The processes are slow, even in Europe. And something that really strikes me is that when we compare what's being done in certain countries and in others, we observe real gaps, real differences in the way that decisions are made. The conclusions are sometimes drawn from clinical elements that are very similar. So yes, we're absolutely asking that on one side, this medical, scientific, clinical assessment be managed by Europe. We have good examples of this already. But in parallel, each country must keep sovereignty in terms of defining prices, in terms of their own environment, their strategic therapy options. Professor Razi,
of the centralization of the decision regarding drugs. I'm fully aware that the issues at stake are not the same because approval is about benefit-risk balance, whereas the appraisal or evaluation is more about the competitive advantage of drugs in the clinical context and also in the market context. But can you tell us a little? We are interested to hear about your experience.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I definitely would like to clarify which layer are we talking about, because I heard a little bit that there is no clear defined boundary, what we describe as the new centralized or non-centralized appraisal. As you say, the first layer is very clear, is benefit risk. We are very confident that we go back 25 years ago, benefit risk, everybody says, cannot be universally established. Everybody has a different meaning. Proved that was wrong. It took 20 years, it took 10 years to go up to speed. And this journey has been led by 4 or 5 more mature and more experienced authorities, and then the other came along. The next layer, I think, is the clinical added value. Of course, with my position, I do not step in the pricing, but I think we can contribute very, very efficiently in determining the value. The clinical added value is, of course, another universal value. Cannot be geographically different for the patient, the clinical added value. I'm not saying it's an absolute number. It's an overchanging number, overchanging bar assessment, but as I said, is a universal value, even beyond the boundary of Europe. Can we establish this value at the same time that we establish the benefit risk? I think yes. We are ready for that, can go in parallel rather than in sequence. All the players have the right to know exactly what evidence has to be generated. The payer, because they want to know exactly what they're paying for. The developer, they want to know upfront all the evidence they have to get there to the magic moment, which is not anymore the benefit risk, is later. And the patient, who should know exactly, as soon as this is established, will generate a lot of tension to have different way to determine the clinical added value. I might stop here for now, but
I might ask you another question right now, because this morning it has been clearly said that the regulator should stay independent on the appraisal. And I've also heard that because if you have in mind the fact that there is a price just after the appraisal, it could bias the decision of benefit risk and after the appraisal. So where should we delineate the role of the regulator toward the appraisal?
I fully agree with that. I don't think we have to change our remit. The benefit risk is something that should stay alone and not, in any case, confused with other value. The clinical added value is something that should be closely linked to the benefit risk. Also because we are talking already something that is already emerging. We are talking on the old-fashioned medicines. The zone on uncomfort zone of the payer is that the benefit risk and the added value generally is a statistic result of a population described not in the granularity that is needed. With the precision medicine, and I'm not talking next 10 years, I'm talking next 6 months, 4 in 10 years, 4 this year, 16 next 6 months. This will be over. The subgroup, down to the individual, will be predefined in the development. So that's why I think we can define, and of course we are eager to contribute to that, because the first set of evidence holds in the hand of the, is held in the hand of the regulator. Why should we reproduce those data? Why we should add the data afterwards?
Okay, thank you, very clear. Nicolas Revel.
Nicolas Revel, you're the only payer around the table. So we're not going to talk about price straight away, but quickly. For the assessment part, I think you have an opinion because it impacts you and it limits you. It's taken in France. It's not, the price is not defined by you. We contribute to the negotiation in our group. If the decision is taken further away than it is now, will it be a problem for you? Would you say that the level of expertise will have to increase? I'm going to start from the point of view of the payer who is interested in the last part of the process, which is price negotiation. And I see in the presentations that were made that underlying that, we have the representatives of industry who want things to be quicker and easier in the assessment process. And on the other side, we have nation states that would have a more defensive, protective position, defending their national sovereignty. And if we put ourselves on the side of the price negotiation, let's share the fact that we all want more European dialogue, because the current situation, the starting situation, we're all familiar with it. We're in an asymmetric situation today in the building of the price of drugs, in the negotiations that take place between companies and the nation states. Why? Everyone knows we no longer really negotiate public prices. We basically negotiate discounts that are covered by confidentiality clauses that mean that no country really knows what the other countries have negotiated for the same product. So from this standpoint, yes, there are reflections, discussions that could lead us to more transparency, more dialogue between the member states, and that could reduce the asymmetry that exists. We'll come to the methods, the responses that don't necessarily convince us that the response would be awarding the whole assessment process with impacts on prices to a single integrated European body. I think it's important not to make a caricature there, saying that there are some in favor of European dialogue and other states that want to just defend their own territory. What I wonder is, if there is unification of the product assessment, would it not increase the constraints on the decisions that are a result of this assessment. An assessment is used to know whether or not we'll accept a product for treatment and reimbursement, at what rate it will be done, and at what price. So the question is to know, beyond the question of principle, is it possible at a given point to separate the assessment process from its different stages? Today we see that there's an assessment for the medical service rendered. France works this way, this medical service rendered, and then the improvement. So there are a whole series of decisions that are taken in the assessment process, admission or not to reimbursement, what level of reimbursement, and then what's decided in the first two phases determines the rest of the process. So what you're suggesting to industrial companies is they're all enthusiastic about this assessment. Will they be centralizing the risk instead of diluting it in the different states? That's a question I could have asked them. If it doesn't work, it won't work anywhere. Well, let me just qualify what I said. When you say that we have innovations and we're slowed down by a national assessment process that obliges us to go through X different evaluation processes in X different countries, and they're more or less quick in the process, we do observe, all of us, bigger and earlier arrivals to market. It's early in development time. Well, the go-to-market time is better in France than in other countries. Well, but for the assessment on one hand, and I'm not sure if in other countries it's that long, but on the definition and negotiation of price, which represents more than half of the lead time, and we often talk with Philippe Lamoureux, who will speak after me, I clearly feel that there's a lot of progress to be made on the duration of the negotiations, but it will be a shared effort, because when a negotiation lasts a long time, it's not only the fault of one or the other, it's negotiation strategies that are conjugated to reach that result.
Thank you very much. Over to Philippe. So Nicolas Revel wants to talk about the price, but can we just come back to the assessment for a while? The frontier line is very clear. The assessment, first of all, the assessment is what brings us together. The appraisal depends on the competence of the member states. And then there's what Natalie was explaining. We can see that the European directive has three interests. First of all, it has an interest for patients. This is what the representative of Eurodis was saying, talking about patients who require rapid access to assessments and treatment. Then, of course, there's another interest, that of fast access for industrial companies. There's something else that we haven't talked about so far, and that is the interest for member states who have no developed assessment system. And one of the interests of the directive, one of the advantages, is to improve certain assessment systems. And I think there's a real challenge here that we can focus on. So what I regret is, well, we set up the system in Europe with the public authorities and the drug agency. We thought that the European AMM would never work, the marketing authorization. Nobody is contesting these marketing authorizations today. And I think we're in the same situation today when it comes to the efficiency of the REA at European level. So that's what we're talking about. We can regret, we can be sorry about the fact that, and this is what we heard with Madame Le Guludec, who had a very cautionary approach. When we try and wonder why France is so cautionary, perhaps there are three possible explanations to this. First of all, this is understandable, it's the lack of means for assessing, the lack of means of the health authority. There's an increase in workload for these institutions. So we've got solutions for the marketing authorization, and we're also finding solutions for the yes. And there are other things that are more delicate, more difficult. France would not want assessments from other European countries. And this reasoning, we believe that, on the contrary, France can be the leader in this. With our German counterparts, we could help to build that assessment system. This has been the case up until very recently, in fact. And the third point is that French authorities imagine that we were going to remove the mechanism and remove a certain number of competencies that would have an impact on price setting. Now, Philippe Lamoureux talked about expertise, and I know...
Indeed, people were saying that we don't want our citizens to take drugs that are evaluated by Portuguese people. It's not my opinion, it is a citation from a sociologic book. And the conclusion is totally the reverse, is that all former, less experienced countries now have elevated their level of expertise. And this morning we have heard the president of the Haute Autorité de Santé qui a dit on ne doit garantir qu'on ne dégrade pas ce qu'on a au niveau national. So
says that we have to guarantee that we don't deteriorate this.
our expertise are that it would just decrease the level of the expertise. Can you tell us about that?
I can only tell about my experience.
But which is a success in European agencies?
It's one of the success, I can say. What happened when I took over in 2011? 6 authorities were carrying out 85% of all the scientific work. France, of course, was among that. Germany is still one of the major contributors, UK, and so forth. So eventually, we decided to expand this knowledge, and now we enjoy that 18 contribute. Of course, not everybody contributes at the same level. The most sensitive and difficult files are still in the most experienced team. We have the rule that the best available team will be the rapporteur. And this is exactly what is happening. So over the time, you might, the committee is coming to decide who can deal with that file. Now we launched the multinational team. So there is a senior team. We might have, might be short of one quality or oncologist or whatever, and can pick in each country the lack expert, the missing expert. That is how it works. So I will see certainly that at the beginning, the country less experienced will benefit of the most experienced. They will learn and they will contribute. That is a setting that has to be established eventually and not now. How will be the methodology to carry out that? So I see that there are more questions how rather than if.
Okay, thank you. Les industriels, donc.
So our companies, Mr. Razi says that this helps with pooling knowledge. Then we have to see that the assessment of drugs is a decision that involves a lot more parameters. It's more complex. We said it this morning, the people said it this morning, we have to take into account monitoring comparators, clinical trials. Is it going to be more complicated to have a centralized assessment system, which is what you're going to do? I'm a little bit perplexed. What we're saying, what we said this morning, says that there is a kind of consensus. Mrs. Grosstedt insisted this morning. She said that the future of health will be European or there will be no future. We all believe that we have to differentiate the scientific assessment and the economic assessment. The scientific assessment has to have its experts. So we're not talking about a decision, we're talking about the proposal of a tool that will allow us to make a decision in each country. And yet I don't really know what the blocking point is. What is the stumbling block? And given the discussions from this morning, what are the points that are sticking points? There are countries that are promoting this kind of development in Europe. And they seem to be so cautious. I felt that there was caution in the discussion this morning, but I can't really understand why. Can somebody around the table say something about this? Philippe, do you have a theory? Well, I can't really answer why. What I'm worried about is that we've been working on all of this for 12 years. And so we've got this European regulation. So we've been working together in the ENET HTA. So tell us what it is. Not everybody's an expert. Well, in 2006, we created the platform bringing together the member countries around the goal to have an HTA, a shared health technology assessment, so that we could bring together our expertise. In 2008, a level pharmaceutical roundtable took place, and there was a differentiation made between scientific and economic assessments at European and national level. And we worked together. The last part is Joint Action 3. We've had 1, 2, and 3. And under Joint Action 3, which is recent, this year, the 3 products were assessed jointly. So it was something that was done. So there was a study of the Commission that looked into the results on a voluntary basis. Not all countries act in the same way. So we realized that it's difficult to plan ahead for patients and for us, because in France, you'd have to start right from the scratch. So what seems bizarre is that we've been working for 10 years. The regulation is planning on 6 years for the transition. So even if we approve the regulation this year or next year, we'll still have another 6 years to make sure that the end quality and satisfies everybody. So we want a European healthcare system. We want a strong Europe, as President Macron says. But we haven't got anything yet, and yet we've been working for 12 years. Nicolas. Well, I might find what you say in relation to France, Germany, about the fact that we would be wrong not to move towards this new organization for European assessment. It's completely, I would find it acceptable. If I could hear you talk about European negotiations on prices. And that's something that I haven't heard about. Now, what's been said, so that would raise lots of questions as well. I heard the opposite. Did you suggest that? No, this morning we heard the opposite. Member states wanted to keep that to themselves. No, it's just what I'm suggesting. I'm listening to you. So I would find the position of companies much more robust and consistent if you wanted to move towards more of Europe in the 2 segments. We're just looking at it from an assessment point of view. I think that the negotiator is going to be the payer. But when I listen to you wanting to move towards an entirely European assessment, I can, and I think this is what other people might be thinking, I can ask the question, at the end of the day, the position, the negotiations, the member states, and we're talking about very difficult negotiations because, friends, you come along here, you want prices to be set, and the prices are very high for some products, and they will really be putting pressure on our healthcare system. So I think we have a collective subject that we could be working on here. And we're worried that this Europeanization of the assessment process may weaken the negotiating position that we have, which is already weakened by the asymmetry that you're benefiting from more than us. Now, there's something I don't understand, Philip. If there are more of us, we've got more negotiating power to limit what economists call the market power and monopolies. We'll come back to that maybe later on. Member states, so they have their attributions, etc., they should be working, dialoguing more about the assessment. We heard that this morning. We haven't got a conservative position, and also on prices, because we need to work more together. We need to exchange more ideas. so that we can build, we need to have a unified negotiating system. So let me hand over to my colleague. Now, I'll show some schizophrenia here. And let me go back to what Nicolas has said. We know the reservations of member states. France has been very clear with respect to its reservations. Germany as well, with respect to its reservations. We know how to identify them. Just to answer Frédéric's question, I'm going to give two or three examples. There's this mandatory aspect of the assessment. That's problematic. We've clearly identified it. It's problematic for the French authorities. And companies, Natalie, when we talked with the industrial members, well, many of them were not favorable with the idea of this assessment. And at the end of the day, it's very difficult agreeing. If the system exists, will everybody be part of it? The Germans have a problem with the comparator. We know that the Germans want to keep the definition of their own comparator. France has a vision based on expertise. So the comparator, what's that? When we develop a new drug, we compare it to a placebo, and when there's an equivalent treatment, we compare it to that. So the French have a Franco-French vision of expertise that they would like to impose on the rest of Europe, and that's a problem as well. Everybody can understand that. So I think that the points for debate are there. We have them. We'll see what comes out of Europe at the end of the week. I think, well, I remain optimistic. I think we can find a compromise. At least we have to find that compromise. When I listen to what's being said since this morning, if you're pro-European, you might come out of this day rather depressed. But coming back to the price question, we already have a European price. It's called the Framework Agreement for SMR 1 to 3. So products, so innovations, breakthrough innovations, so improving the health service for 1 to 3 grades. We're in a price corridor with our British friends, Germans, Italians, and Spanish friends. And I can even say something else. France, in 93% of cases, we're in the lower bracket of the price, and in 50% of prices, we've got the lowest price out of the 5 countries. So we're talking about the public price, yes. The price is not just the public price. It is the public price. And for the SMRs, 1, 2, and 3, the price is built on discounts. So just to translate that, and then I'll hand over the floor. So the public price and the other price, we're not talking about the net price. It's just say that we're not very expensive. And at the end of the day, that's what we get from the negotiations. Well, the discount modifies that face price. Well, companies want to negotiate prices of a certain level because they use them to get onto other markets, them being more open. So there are financial discounts paid, covered by clauses of confidentiality that are negotiated. So when you say that there's a European price, no, there is no European price for innovative molecules. Nobody knows the real price of drugs. Yes.
View about the evidence. I think at the end you find common element, and there are kind of a common agreement in some way. What I think is not clear is what is the highest level of the bar of the assessment that can be accepted by everybody. Coming down, what is not acceptable? What is not acceptable is to see how to deliver, what price to pay for a new therapeutical option to deliver in a given system. That I understand it's pretty much national. Below this, you have the benefit risk. We already agreed that is a common value. It works. Universal value. In the middle, there is the added value. If we go in the clinical added value, we cannot reach a common sense because it's pretty much scientific. It's a matter of what evidence we want to assess and what evidence we have, and if we want to be efficient, what evidence we have to generate upfront. So evidence to generate it by design upfront, driven also with the payer and the health technology assessment body. And then after the benefit risk, what is the next level that is uncontroversial, a universal value? And there is. We have to define the methodology. The rest of this layer, of course, will go back to there. So instead of discussing if we have to do, why we don't start to discuss what is the bar that is efficiently and is a benefit, is added value for everybody to know as soon as possible, to start to build the third layer. Mm-hmm. That is my point. Two quick things. Comparator. I have the example 110 voluntary assessment. They all sit together. They disagree on everything. Everything. They leave the table, they agree on 80% of things, including comparator. So I think there is only one way, learning by doing.
Okay, so you want to attenuate the concern that finding a common comparator would be an issue?
Is an issue.
Or an unsolved issue.
And I can add on that. In the future, there will be no comparator. A gene therapy has no comparators.
Exactly. Okay. Ouais.
Non, juste pour rebondir sur ce que disait Nicolas.
To come back to what Nicolas was saying, so facial discussion, it's not always easy because opinion, well, we're often surprised by this price because they're not the prices in reality. Now, given this point, in all countries, in all European markets, country managers negotiate with more or less the same roadmap. And yet some countries have agreements quicker than others. It's 133 days for France, whereas it should be 180 days. Oh, that's the standard. So maybe in other countries they do it better. So the second point, well, this is something that has to be brought up carefully. This is true for payers because negotiations are inflationist. When you've got no more margin for negotiation and you're talking with the state, you tend to give yourself less room for maneuver. You start at a higher level. So in some countries, we've tried to talk about net prices, and we've had to go back to the mechanism that we have today. So just to add to that, I understand the question that is being raised with respect to the assessment and the price. Now, one of the reasons that we have these gaps, even for the facial price that we see, it's linked to the fact that sometimes with the same clinical observation, there are assessments that are different from state to state. So you can have the same data and interpretations that are different. In our labs, we all have many examples of similar assessments leading to different results or appreciations. I think that the European assessment, the scientific clinical assessment, makes it possible to present. It's what I was saying earlier on. It's not about giving it an assessment, but giving the tools that allow each state sovereignly and independently to do its assessment according to its own context, according to its level of maturity, its healthcare system, its choices, etc. But I think that effectively, it's like it would be like having a common thermometer. This would allow us to have the same indicator in order to make choices.
Yes, I wanted to come back to the two questions of assessment and price. If we start with a common basis, that's already a simplification that would be very important. Now, when we talk about comparators, we are asking that in the regulation proposed, that we introduce scoping meetings before the assessment where we can agree on the scope. Yes, but at the HTA level, so that we know where we're starting, and it's all of the member states that leave the meeting agree on the elements at the end of the day. So I think that is very important. What is also I often talk about prices. I know we're going towards extraordinary medications and certain cures. What is the price of a cure for hemophilia B for certain generations? It's very difficult to assess. But what always struck me when I arrived 18 months ago in the pharmaceutical sector and having worked in the biotech sector is we never talk about healthcare systems, the cost of a therapy and everything that takes place afterwards in the healthcare system. We talk about the price of the medication, the price in the hospitals, etc. Maybe we should start to have a conversation with not just you in the state insurance agency, but we don't have the same situation in all the member states. We don't have this conversation, or what are the gains? What are we avoiding? What costs are we avoiding in the future? We need to have a more joint discussion. I agree with this idea that there is, in the field of European cooperation, perhaps a challenge that should be focused on the real-life studies of the therapeutic efficacy of medications. We know that there was a challenge. We want them to arrive more and more early on in the process of clinical trials. We want them to arrive more rapidly to the market, and often there's very little hindsight as to the therapeutic effect observed. And a real-life observation at the scale of several countries would certainly be something that would be very useful beyond just this time segment, which is the initial assessment. Secondly, you're completely right when you say that we shouldn't reason in terms of just the price of a drug or a product without focusing also on the savings that might be generated by this new therapy on the entire chain of treatment. This is a viewpoint that is strongly and regularly expressed by the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm very sensitive to this viewpoint, and it justifies that we work on this. Obviously, we need to work at the national and the European level. Earlier, Nicolas Revel said something. He challenged you on the fact that you just wanted the assessment to be European, but maybe not setting the prices. You didn't totally answer that question. But yes, there's in some literature, they propose rules to set the prices. There are databases in open access. The American Cancer Society, for example, has set up a framework to interpret prices. And this is starting to work. So why, if you're in favor of centralizing assessment, couldn't we maybe agree on theoretical prices and the cost of the drug and objectivize the cost of research and development? No, that's a viewpoint that's not. I think in your question itself, you've just explained why it's not. I think that the member states, such as industry, are not asking for a European price. It's not just industry. But in your question itself, you gave the answer on the basis of what healthcare system, what economy, what savings. Well, this has been proposed. Well, we're in a pre-electoral period. Do you think this will be very popular as an idea? You think the European citizens are dreaming of a unique price that would be imposed on the overall level? No, it wouldn't be a single price. And whatever the systems all around the world? Well, no. Independently of the citizens, wouldn't it be less exhausting to have a price that was more or less fixed ahead of time rather than having to negotiate country by country? Well, I don't think that's the problem. It's the needs of the patient in the country and the constraints associated with that. Well, I think there are some countries that are working together already, and the position of industry is to say, if this allows a more rapid access to the patients, we can be favorable, provided that all of the other quality assurance standards are present. We don't want the quality to go down. I often don't work in French, so we're not against this if it helps get access to the patients more rapidly. But we think that each country, Malta, France, Sweden, Ireland, you have therapeutic priorities and economic situations, healthcare systems that are completely different. Yes, it is an idea, but we have a lot of issues that we have to solve beforehand. We have this question of the HTA. We have a lot downstream as well. I've observed that, for example, the definition of target populations is not necessarily the same from one country to the next. If we have the same price, we should have the same target populations, for example. For example, France is more restrictive in the definition of its target populations versus other European countries. So we have to put all of this on the table. We have to go step by step. The market authorization is a fundamental step. We're now at the second step, which is the clinical assessment. Maybe at a given moment we will go towards pricing, but I think it's much more complicated because we have healthcare systems and budgets that can't be compared. When we negotiate the framework agreement, we take countries that are comparable to our own. When we start the discussions with the health insurance, the state agencies, and they ask us to put Greece into the reference basket and Switzerland, and then we end up with basket. We try to work with baskets of countries that are comparable. So I think it can be envisaged, but it will be much more complex. I tried to ask your question again, as you saw. And yes, it is a good question, but I heard the answer, I think. Well, I'm convinced, once again, that in terms of assessment, and Dominique Le Gudet said the same this morning, it's under their responsibility. But for price negotiations, I think interstate cooperation is an area where we must make progress and more progress between countries. I think, as Dominique said this morning, there are certain things that are already taking place today in terms of assessment, and I think this would allow us to have joint assessments on maybe several dozens of products. Some agencies are working together. And in terms of price negotiations, I would find it very useful. Some European countries have already launched cooperation work, such as Benelux, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Belgium, I think Austria, the Nordics, certain countries around La Valette, Malta. But France and Germany are actually, quote unquote, outside of these measures and these systems. I believe that France should deeply consider adopting an approach to explore this type of negotiation system. We could start with some drugs for orphan diseases, or on certain products to have a lead with a purchasing group from one country, for example, to test some models. I think it would be beneficial. We shouldn't say that Europe should only be in charge of assessment and nothing in terms of prices. I think in terms of prices, there are some things that can be done. It took them 25 years to reach a market authorization on the European level. I don't know how long it will take for European clinical trial assessment, maybe 10 years. Maybe we can accelerate. So indeed, as you said, the industry is not closed to this idea. That's obvious. Well, I want to ask you this question now. In February 2017, I think François Hollande, the French president, put the subject on the table, and nothing much has happened since then. But you're also concerned. What do you think you could do at your scale? Well, it's really a topic that has to be supported at the governmental level. When you're a large country, you can always have the idea that you're capable of negotiating better than others. And because nobody knows what the others have negotiated, it's easy for you to believe this. You think people are that naive? Well, each time you negotiate with someone who says they've never seen such a tough negotiator, you can conclude that maybe you've failed in your negotiation. So you see some small countries that spontaneously group together because they believe spontaneously that this will reinforce their bargaining position. And large countries such as Germany and France may have this feeling that thanks to their market, they necessarily will have the best prices. This may explain the reasons why we, again, have not overcome this obstacle. I think we need to give it more thought in the coming years. Well, absolutely. Let me come back to two ideas, to not just stop at the price of the drug, but to broaden this reflection at the European level. Because I think that the therapies that are arriving and those that we already have will require this. And not only the price to develop these products and the small numbers of the population involved by these therapies, the transformation of the healthcare chain, the hospitals that must completely transform their systems, these pathology units that will be replaced by something else. So I think there's a whole transformation that's coming, and we must support this transformation by speaking not in silos, but it's something that we're trying to do at the European level. I really like the idea of setting up a stepwise. We started with the European Drug Agency and with now scientific assessment, and then we need to go to the third step. We need to have a foundation and not continue just to discuss infinitely. Europe needs to launch very strong signals in terms of competitiveness and predictability. And I know I'm repeating myself, but the Brexit is weakening us as the European region. You can be happy or not with the Brexit, but it's a fact. At the global level, China is increasing its incentives in terms of intellectual property. The United States have many other resources for industrial policy. So Europe should clearly show that we are united and consistent and that we're ready to move forward and with this technological development. Well, I have a few rapid. It would be paradoxical to go towards a system of European prices when we don't yet have a European assessment system. So as Frédéric said, we have to do things in the right order. Secondly, to reassure Nicolas that he is a good negotiator. If France were a country with high prices, we would be. We are a country of parallel export, which shows a lot about the price of French drugs. The third element concerns the coordination, European coordination. There are three mechanisms that are currently trying to operate: the Finos and Valletta Group and Beneluxa, as you said, with Benelux and Austria. These three groups. And the only system that's really working well is the Beneluxa system. And it works if the industry takes the option to work via this system. It's not a system that's imposed on the industrialist. It's that the industrialists choose or not to work with it. Well, let me emphasize and come back to one point. Real-life assessment of drugs, because I think this is an element where we are collectively weak and where the subject of assessment must be extended, and it must be linked to this question of price negotiation. And here, in this respect, France really can say that we must work on this. So what you're trying to say, I think, is that we could have a closer, more rapid assessment of the real effects of medication to adjust the prices. Yes, the general idea that I'm trying to put on the table here is that we are convinced that we should work in an interstate cooperation mode for both evaluation and for price negotiation. And we should pinpoint this question of real-life assessment, because given the innovations that are arriving today, I really think that for all of our countries, this is the number one question. You mean because treatments are arriving faster, we don't know them very well, we price them on the basis of assessment elements that are quite synthetic and quite fragile, with very little hindsight. This is why I think we need to invest strongly in this respect.
I fully support this vote. In future, only the real-world evidence, the real clinical evidence, will be the only possibility to really reinforce the benefit risk and reinforce all the system. And now I agree we are very weak. We rely on everything done before. The fragmentation of the population, the life changer drug that are coming, a gene therapy, a cell therapy, need the monitoring lifetime, need a new pricing model, but that is beyond me, need a planned ahead monitoring of safety and efficacy at the same time, cannot be disjunct anymore. And that should be rapidly reinform the regulatory decision in terms of benefit risk. Download it, we step out here, and we download to reevaluate the added clinical value in the real life. So without a strong attempt in monitoring the real world evidence, so-called real world clinical evidence, we won't fail, all of us. We will fail.
Yes, we need standards. We need interoperability of data to do so. We really have to invest a lot in interoperability. And the commissioner was very clear this morning and she really was very familiar with the healthcare sector. We need to make huge leaps forward. There are some countries and regions that are very strong. There are best practices that exist. In Italy, they have an oncology register that's very successful in terms of real-world evidence. So we need to use these best practices to move forward. And this is part of this healthcare system that I think we need to look at. The biotechnological revolution and the data revolution are taking place in parallel. And real-world evidence is linked to data collection. So real-life evidence. Well, someone said this, I think, today. They talked about Europe of fear. And I think in the way we're approaching this, none of us really has approached this notion, what need this is meeting and what will be the benefits in terms of time for the patient, attractiveness for the European territory, the benefits in terms of efficiency with respect to cost, and the overall benefits that are generated by this system of European assessment, which does not challenge all of the local prerogatives. And there's one point that's very important, I think. I think, indeed, France and Germany must accelerate to be real drivers on the topic. But there are a certain number of reservations that are important. This assessment should be mandatory for the states, and each country should not start repeating its own assessment afterwards. So that should be imposed on the countries. There should be maybe a system of appeal, but to appeal the decision. But I think we need to look at the needs and the benefits that we expect. I agree with Nicolas. It's much a consensus. I think real-life data has become absolutely essential, and everything that we're saying is going in the same direction. We must look at the operation of the public authorities. How can we move away from a mechanism that multiplies all of these obstacles to market access to something that really fluidifies? And here, this is a huge challenge for our system, and it's not true only for France, I think.
Well, we're going to stop here. We have 1 minute left. I would just like to remind you that the patient's access to market, to therapeutic innovations that are real promises for healing, even if you give us long lead times in France above the averages in other countries. We still have a lot of ATUs in France every year that allow you to have access to market in very quick periods. But access to market on real innovations in France today does exist. There are what we call ATUs, and we need to maintain them.
Innovation can be defined and uncontroversial if you use the OMIC. You should force this guy to invest. And don't underestimate the data usage in the real-world evidence, because can feed back much faster and efficient.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à tous. Merci à l'audience. Merci beaucoup. Merci.